On the farm.
On the farm.
Nice.
Everyone.
And there's some new people, I think. Alvin, Rachel, Lisette's back. Rachel, where in the world are you?
I'm in LA.
Okay, cool. Welcome.
Hey, everybody. Thanks.
What do you work on?
I work on food and waste and kind of intersections of those. Yeah.
Cool. And Alvin, what part of the world are you in?
Sorry, one second. Hey, I'm in Shanghai.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Super.
I'm here at the recommendation of Mary Magic. We're in this other chat study group together, and then she kindly shared the information. Yeah, I work as a writer and curator.
Great. Yeah, I love Mary's work. So friend of Mary.
Say hi to Mary.
Yeah, Stefan also knows Mary.
Yep.
I see.
Hey Emma, welcome. And Michelle. And Grace is back. Welcome back, Grace. So Stefan, should we go ahead and get started? It seems like I bet more people are going to kind of pop in the next few moments. Elizabeth, go ahead and push record. So Elizabeth's the host today. So yeah, if you have any trouble with mute, just direct message her, and we'll maybe do it like last time. If questions emerge, maybe just write them in the chat, and I'll try to moderate. Stefan, do you want to start off by saying stuff, or I can ask you leading questions, or try to dig into the piece?
I mean, I wrote a few things down that I can spiel out. I don't know if that's boring or not boring.
Spiel away.
I don't know everybody on this. I don't know if there's a good way for everybody to introduce themselves. Maybe one way to do it would be in the chat. If everybody just said one word about what they're interested in, that I could just sort of see spool by, that might be fun.
Wow, that's a challenge, one word.
Or it can be 2 words. It can be, not 15 words.
I like that idea.
So yeah, I can just sort of start. I reread this piece earlier today of mine, along with the pangolin piece. And it was super interesting to kind of do the time machine thing and figure out what it was I said when and why and what it might mean now. And I guess, yeah, I was interested in this piece. I don't know if everyone's been able to read it, but if you haven't, a very, very quick thing that I guess I was up to was thinking about increasingly agenealogical accounts and modes of biogenetic connection in the age of genomics and bioinformatics, and models that offered diagrams of relatedness that looked less like trees and more like webs and nets and rhizomes and so on. And that those models came into sharp visibility in the early 2000s, particularly in microbiology and the emergence of knowledge about lateral gene transfer. But they also came into being, at the same time as these different computational models for rendering those kinds of portraits. So, for comparing different gene sequences based on their similarity, which may or may not actually be due to common ancestry, that permitted the making of all these multiple trees and contradictory phylogenetic trees, which then suggested to geneticists that, absent some durable part of the genome that might be immune from such transfer, it might be the case that the tree model just doesn't work at all for mapping most microbial relatedness. So the idea that there would be one true tree kind of fell apart. And I guess I was interested in a subset of those agenealogical models, those which sought to characterize microbes in the ocean, and also those that tried to kind of grapple with the possible ways of thinking about hereditary gene through lines that might or might not lead to the origin of life. And that asking the question that way then made the whole tree thing kind of look more tangled. And obviously, geneticists still generate phylogenetic trees, even if they're multiple. And one of the things that struck me about some of the scientific papers on COVID that we've all been looking at over the past few weeks is that continued preoccupation with using phylogenetic trees to ask questions about origin. And particularly with organismic origin, like what is it, a bat, is it a pangolin? And then, you know, using genomes as kind of metonymic for, or standing in for those organisms. So, you know, we had the paper called The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2, then there's the Epidemiology Evolution, and all of them are interested in origins, even in the case of the pangolin paper, which is about the intermediaries that transfer viruses trans-specifically. But there's something really different about the origins that are sought in these COVID papers than the origins that were sought by my deep sea marine biology interlocutors who are looking at origins in the abyss. So in the deep ocean case, the association, I think, of the deep ocean with deep time, with a deep past, with a kind of submarine alterity, made the lateral gene transfer question almost into a kind of theoretical, abstract question that was going on somewhere else in a submarine zone of alterity, you know, in a bioinformatic kind of cyber-spatialized soup of information, and not at all the zone in which the transfer of the coronavirus is being discussed, which really thickly mixes together the human, the non-human, the more than human, not to mention the kind of the irreversible time of history. So the question of origin in the COVID queries does not, you know, point to this quasi-theoretical space, but to the space that's very thickly about sociality, multi-species sociality, biopolitics, gastropolitics, you know, the politics of eating, even as the figure of water, think of all the wet market talk, constantly features as a kind of genetic lubricant in these stories. So, although it's useful to step back from the super legible sociality tale, which is, I think, probably what we mostly want to talk about, it's interesting to point out that the computational and bioinformatic phylogenetic tree making is still happening here and still subject to all the kinds of questions that STS people and anthropology of technoscience people might want to ask, like about the sources of and the categories of the data, about sequence annotation, about sequence alignment. And so just looking back at the papers, the COVID-19 epidemiology paper that we looked at has a whole bunch of qualifications in those little text boxes that kind of travel along with the paper, where the scientists kind of know that processes of convergent evolution and recombination might make similarities that are not due to common descent appear. And so multiple runs through the data then produce these swarms of trees as a way just to converge on a hypothesis, right? All of these papers actually only ever offer an hypothesis. And if you read them closely, they're constantly using these adverbs and adjectives of qualification, right? So the one for today, the pangolin one, says, quote, "These novel pangolin coronavirus genomes have 85 to 92% sequence similarity to SARS-CoV-2 and represent two sublineages of SARS-CoV-2. And there's something that totally slips right there, right? Which is a claim about 85% similarity suddenly becomes a claim about lineage in the same sentence, even though the similarity could be due to all kinds of things that are not about ancestry. So it remains super difficult once one's entered the realm of genetic and bioinformatic reduction to always control the evolutionary directions that the data is pointing to, even though these papers are sort of obsessed with, like, what is the origin? Where did it come from? And that's kind of what and then of course there's all kinds of other data, like the shape of the spike protein, the functional proteomics, which operates at a different level than the genomics. And that's kind of some stuff that I started thinking about, and maybe that's a good way to just open it up. I have some other stuff, but it'll come up. I hope that wasn't too long.
That was great. That was great. One of the things I wanted to draw you out a little bit on was biosociality. So in here, you have a really important line that I think has, you know, I've seen kind of this line go through your work over the decades. Biology cannot mean anything in itself, and so particular biopolitics do not follow from a given articulation of bare life. And you know, right now we're all being asked to reconfigure our biopolitics and microbiopolitics, and to use one of your other words that came up, I think, in Caitlin's paper, Symbiopolitics. So what do you make of this emergent biological form as it pertains to this classic Helmreich quote, biology cannot make anything in itself, or cannot mean anything in itself?
Well, there's a discourse about biology, and you know, we're in the thick of a particular one right now, which, oh my God, that is so multiple, right? And I mean, I guess that's what I'd love everybody to just say what they think about. Oh, I forgot to look in the chat. But you know, one sort of node of the biological discourse is about the virus, right? And so, for example, in a lot of the graphics we've seen about the spread, you know, the predicted rise of cases, the predicted spread of the virus, those are in some ways extremely virocentric, right? And they assume a generic, averagely kind of distanced social humanity, right? In order for that thing to work, like those diagrams of the rise and fall of the coming spikes and so on are kind of from the virus's point of view, right? Which leaves out all the stuff, I mean, in the model, right? It leaves out all the stuff that we so much care about, which are things like the unbelievable racial disparities, the geopolitical disparities in how this is moving, right? And also it sort of tables all these questions about origin that we should be rather digging into, which of course we've seen lots and lots of people doing super well, right? That it is about deforestation, that it is about the Anthropocene, that there are all these other origin things that diagram just can't get at, right? So I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but like what is the biopolitical object that's being focused on at different moments, right? And what does it make visible and what does it obscure?
Mm-hmm. Michelle, you've got some interesting thoughts in the chat here about alien kin, the intimate stranger that aligns with COVID-19 thinking. Do you want to unravel those a little bit?
Says, and I was reading that along with the two articles, and yeah, and the fact that I have somebody in my family who's got COVID, I mean, a close member of my family, so who's overseas. So I think that's that inspired, I mean, motivated me to write that, just in terms of that intimacy, because I've been doing a bit of work on ecological intimacy, and so rather than having that romantic idea of intimacy, it's this COVID-19 makes you think of it in a very different way. Right. Maybe that's something that I'm not sure whether I'm clear, but anyway, that's.
Do you have any thoughts, Stefan?
Lots of thoughts, but let's hear more from.
I've got another question. So Gilroy came up in this piece, the classic book Against Race, where he's arguing that, you know, sort of knowledge of biology is going to destroy racism, and I think we're in a moment where we have more knowledge of COVID. That hey Heather.
Hey. Hi everybody. Sorry to interrupt.
No,
we're talking about microbiopolitics, among other things.
Microbiopolitics.
Pull up a chair if you can stay.
Pull up a chair, pull up a rectangle.
You know, just in the same way, I think that emergent knowledge of genomics didn't really destroy race. We also haven't seen racism being destroyed by viral genealogies. I mean, what you see from a lot of the sequencing data is that we are closer viral kin with Roberta in Italy than we are with Alvin in Shanghai, just based on the viral strains that have entered the geobody of the United States. So maybe like thinking back to this idea of biology cannot mean anything in itself. Like how do you make, you know, why didn't Gilroy work? Why didn't, you know, why didn't race magically disappear when we had this knowledge of genomics? And you know, there's a lot that could be said about the current moment too, and the antagonism and xenophobia in the US and China and elsewhere.
I mean, there's so many answers to that. I mean, one of the reasons that genomics did not eliminate biological racism was, well, I mean, it's obviously bound up with massive histories of citizenship and belonging, and the continued interest in hereditary relation. There's so many answers to that, right? I mean, race never was biological, or always. I mean, you know, W.B. Du Bois said that it was not a category, but a force field. It was a set of forces, right? And that there's an error. There's a category error made in thinking that it's a category, right? Rather than a whole set of contradictory forces that sometimes deploy things that look like categories, but then of course, turn them upside down, contradict themselves, all of that. But wait, I did want to go back to something you said about kin, or whether some of us are closer viral kin than others, which I would also kind of object to. I mean, as a not object. Well, that's another kind of thing that doesn't necessarily speak for itself, right? Simple connection between people through viruses, and it can mean all kinds of things. Whether it means kin or whether it doesn't mean kin, sort of depends on what you want to do with it, right? So I'm thinking about, you know, Donna Haraway's recent "Make kin not babies," right? And what does she mean by that? That there's lots of ways to make kin, and not all of them have to be routed through the bio, I guess, right? And I guess the other thing that I'm remembering that Donna said way back in the Universal Donors in a Vampire Culture piece was that she writes in there about longing for something that is simultaneously more and less than kinship, right? That kinship can't bear the weight of all relationality, even itself, even as we want to say make kin not babies. The kinship idiom is also something that needs to be strategically leapt away from when it's not working.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Elizabeth asked me to ask my question. And yeah, such a rich set of readings, Eben. Thank you so much again, and thank you, Stefan. And I just small comment that the virocentrism that you talk about, Stefan, that is so true in the representations of COVID is, I mean, another whole set of ironies is that the virus is not alive, that the virus is not actually, or depending on what we call alive, it's a high, it's, you know, the most interdependent organism that you could think of. So when we say, you know, biology only matters if it matters, this is something that, you know, it is not an entity on its own, but yet, yeah, people are making COVID cakes, and, you know, that the image is already completely iconic. But my question was really about religion, and I mean, I loved in your paper these crazy names of these scientists that you can just like invite riffing, and you tell me the names. I'm like, the riff has got to come because this is just hilarious. Like, how could I know? And so that I presume they're real names because
they are real names.
Wouldn't work otherwise. Amazing.
Yeah, I had kind of forgotten that until I reread it today.
So I wanted to kind of ask about the John Paul because so I work on Indigenous DNA as like the fulcrum, and one of the areas that I hang out with is with ancient DNA scientists, and the idea of human origins, which, you know, I don't want to anthropocentrize this discussion, but it is an interesting parallel that the idea of human origins and out of Africa, and which, you know, a lot of scientists will tell you, and social scientists, this is just kind of Adam and Eve infused through data. And I see it's the same arguments that you're looking at here, that, you know, a tree is only a tree for, you know, one gene or one haplotype, and every single one has got a different tree, and they're not really trees. And there's been movement in and out of Africa, and basically we've got no idea what's going on. I mean, that really works for any biological problem. It's like 1,000 times infinitely more complicated, and all of these models are just an effort to try and make meaning in a complete soup of unknowns, and to be able to make policy decisions and try and save lives, because here is the virus and it's killing people, and what kind of knowledge can we make. So I suppose I want to ask about the idea of religion, and whether we're thinking about that as a need to make meaning and to believe, have faith in a particular representation, in a particular model.
Ooh, I don't know. I don't know about religion in general. I mean, I do think that the story of the tree of life has a very specific set of religious kind of now I don't want to say origins, do I? Has a very particular set of cultural coordinates, right? And the imaginary of some primal place that is kind of the beginning of, so in that Trees and Seas piece, I'm writing about a number of these microbiologists who see in the deep sea some kind of submarine Garden of Eden, right? Some kind of origin point from which they think all things begin. And that's completely suffused with a very legibly historical, cosmological view.
And it's womb, of course, Stefan.
Of course, no, yeah. Oh yeah, I mean, in lots of the video, popular culture renditions of the deep sea hydrothermal vents, there's lots of stuff about this being a nursery for life and all kinds of motherly amnion kinds of imagery, right? So it's just layer upon layer of this stuff, which is not very difficult with, History of Science 101 to kind of unpeel as, barely secularized Judeo-Christian, stuff. But I don't know about this larger question of religion and meaning. That requires a bigger conversation that I would love to hear about and have.
There's a lot of comments in the chat room. Roberta, Carolyn, Natalie, Lisette, Anna, if any of you want to jump in. It looks like maybe Anna, your most recent comment sort of relates to this thread of conversation, and then there's some earlier thoughts as well. Maybe just wait. You can unmute yourself. Great.
Yeah, well, I'm a sociologist of religion, so Emma's question
perfect.
and Stefan's answer, and then my comment, I guess, fits in. I mean, I again, when I was reading your piece, I was thinking about similar things to what Emma was discussing. Obviously, like the myth, the origin myths, and certainly Christian or Judeo-Christian. Well, our common understandings of them, of course, they're far more complex than that as well. But our sort of contemporary understanding of them do seem to be this sort of more linear. But my question was actually more that your previous comment about the error, like to me also evoked a kind of underlying error spoken about within, say, yogic or Buddhist philosophy of the error of an illusion of a separate self. That's the sort of ultimate, that's the cause of all suffering, and that the realization of emptiness is really the realization of that we're not separate. It's empty of separateness. It's not empty, it's not nihilistic necessarily, and therefore leads to that realization of interdependence and interconnectivity. And so again, in terms of religion or spirituality, there's different ways and lenses, and I don't mean to be, Orientalist and say the Asian religion, gets it right here, but obviously like your work on Biosociality, other people's work, like, yeah, it evoked that kind of, it made me think about those types of alternate origin stories. When the Dalai Lama is asked about the Big Bang, apparently he says, well, sure, Big Bang, but it's not the first one, so this notion of origin is completely like blown apart.
Yeah, more resources for blowing apart origin is good. Thank you.
My jump in with linking to what Emma was saying, and then with a question for Stefan. So for me, Stefan writings is central because since some years I'm doing ethnography with researchers in metagenomics. So exactly about those computational biologists trying to make taxonomic profiling out of microbiome data. And so her writing has been always a reference for me. And linking to what Emma was asking, this group, specifically this group that I'm doing the ethnography with, has just published a paper to confirm the out of Africa hypothesis based on the analysis of the microbiome, the gut microbiome of some indigenous people. There was a funny, they also took some reused data from an article entitled The Gut Microbiome of Uncontacted Indigenous People, and they were the Yanomami, uncontacted. Anyway, so my work with them was pointing out a little bit, as you said, to all these inconsistencies, and but they stick, as you said, they stick pretty much to this out of Africa hypothesis. And we had a lively discussion about that, but it was not religion, or yes, the religion of pragmatism, because they wanted to stick to the most accepted and conventional hypothesis out there. They said, we are not here to rewrite history. They said, in evolution, you cannot go out and ask. We are not here to rewrite the history of migration, but we are here just to illustrate what we found, and they compare themselves as reporters. They make descriptions of this profiling. So yes, there is a religion part, but it's much about pragmatism and all these parsimony values they have, this economic approach to read data. So that's the way in which I see the religion part. And going to my question to Stefan, the sentence that I pasted here stayed with me a lot when I was watching us observing this group of scientists work. And but now with COVID, I'm wondering if something is different in the way those scientists always say that they are looking who they are and what they are doing, meaning microbes, who the microbes are and what they are doing. And they are pretty good, kind of good in seeing who they are, but they have a bit more difficulties to see what they are doing. But as you write in the paper, that is the interesting part, because then they can exploit these functional processes to create new products and so on. But now actually what the virus is doing is the real matter in a way, but is the real matter not in the hands of humans for exploitations, but on the different side. So I just wanted, since that sentence is so close to me, I just wanted to think through with you how you see that sentence now in this context.
Well, I think you've already said it, right? Which is that the question of what the virus is doing is a question that's being asked with respect to what it's doing to humans and human contexts, human bodies, human sociality, human economies, human systems of meaning, which are not the only thing that the virus is doing. The virus is doing all kinds of things. So I think what you said about, you know, a kind of an approach of a pragmatic view is one that's organizing how the viruses are being addressed. And those pragmatisms are coming from particular kinds of priorities, right? About what governance of polities will be, about what acceptable risk factors are for different kinds of scenarios, right? I mean, we've certainly seen tons of that in popular and public discourse, right? These kinds of staging of different social domains against each other. Risk over here produces risk over there. Risk over here makes it go down over there, right? Which are all these kind of pragmatic, but of course, completely value fraught kinds of questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
I just had a comment. Hi. Hi, everyone. I thought what was really interesting to think about in your paper was to think about the time scales that are very much different in the cases that you're looking at versus the novel coronavirus time scale. So in your paper, I thought what was really fascinating that I've never realized is that the time scale is very geological or evolutionary. So it takes place across, you know, eons. Mm-hmm. And with the novel coronavirus, it seems maybe it's a reflection of like the time-space compressions of like capitalist kinds of pressures. But at the same time, I think there's something going on with the time scale of the coronavirus. I'm not sure if you've thought about it. And that's a way in which it overturns the natural history notion of time in biology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know if it overturns it, but I think you're totally right that time is absolutely key here. And that's a super interesting contrast between the kinds of time that the evolutionary biologists think that they're asking about and the kinds of time that preoccupy us now with the coronavirus. Maybe this goes back to something that Roberta's comment made me think about. In both the evolutionary case and in the case of tracking coronavirus as a bio thingy and its change over time, the question of the molecular clock of the genetic timepiece that's, you know, summoned forth to think about how organisms change or don't over time is kind of crucial, right? So probably you've seen in the recent conversations in the news about the coronavirus about, well, how quickly is it mutating? Are there going to be different strains? And of course, the kind of common wisdom in evolutionary biology is that most mutations are kind of meaningless and don't produce an adaptive or outcome, right? And so, you know, to use the cybernetic language, they're kind of noise, right? And then the ones that are signal are the ones that are super scary. And so there's this sense of like the emergency of coronavirus is also key to the worry about how quickly any kind of mutations that it develops that are deleterious to animals would develop. And in order to track that, you have to have some kind of notion of what your clock is, what part.
I think we lost you, Stefan. Are you still there? Are other people still there?
His clock has frozen.
He's right in the middle of a really interesting thought. Do you want to say anything more, Jia-Hui, about temporality? And I really liked what you were saying about, I mean, there's a historicity that, I mean, we're talking about a historicity of days and weeks with COVID that, I mean, you know, I think in this paper that Stefan wrote, you know, there's this search for kind of alien ontologies. Oh, there, you're back now.
Your clock froze.
Your clock froze. Keep going. It was super interesting.
Yeah, and then, you know, the deep sea biology people also have a notion that they're trying to find some kind of timepiece against which this story will unfold, right? So these are both, to use the Bakhtin term, these are about chronotopes, right? And I guess what's interesting about, I mean, the deep sea story is really super weird, right? Because they're not sequencing the genomes of microbes from 3 billion years ago. They're not doing that. They're using contemporary microbes as proxies for these ancestral ones, right? Which
just
is
like the Yanomami.
What's that?
Just like the Yanomami microbiomes.
Well, exactly. I mean, just like a lot of the genetic genealogy stuff that people like Kim Tallbear and Alondra Nelson write about, those are using contemporary populations as proxies for their ancestors, right? And so there's a totally bizarre thing going on with time there. You know, the more compressed character of what's unfolding with coronavirus is that, you know, the contemporaries of today's coronavirus, you know, the ancestors of today's coronavirus might be like 2 weeks old. So that's a kind of different, you know, a different proxy possibility there. I don't know if that speaks to what you're asking, Jia-Hui, but I think that's totally right, that temporality and the time scale is key to how we're trying to track the biopolitics of this.
Yeah, and just to quickly add as well, I think the other part that just struck me as you were talking is the uniqueness of the virus as well. How, you know, in the undoing of species through these lateral gene transfers, in some ways the time of the virus is very much a viral thing rather than an archaea thing or a plantae thing.
Yeah.
I was just about to ask either of you to comment about futurity and, you know, these different temporal imaginaries. You know, where, so, you know, there's this deep sea project you described, but then like this fast pace of time that where there's a lot of events happening. But then I also feel like we're stuck in the plateau of Benjamin's homogeneous empty time right now, where we can't imagine a future. So what kind of viral events are we waiting for the future to open up again, for history? Because I feel like history's maybe stopped in a way, or like, you know, we're in this miasma of viral clouds that Celia Lowe describes, and, you know, how do we get to the beyond? Like, do either of you see a future imaginary that's where events are gonna, I don't know, I'm just interested in how you're thinking about the future.
Well, I mean, I can say something, and then I want to hear Jia-Hui talk about pangolins a little bit.
Yeah, me too.
But, you know, one of my more recent research obsessions is to do with waves, and the discourse of waves is everywhere in thinking about modeling of the pandemic and what's coming and what's not coming, right? That the idea is that there's a wave approaching, and we have these charts that sort of forecast it, right? And what kind of time lies beyond that wave is not clear, right? I mean, I think on the one hand, yes, there is this kind of homogeneous empty time that, you know, if you're lucky, if you're really lucky, you might be inhabiting if you have one day feel very much like the other, which is certainly not what's happening to a lot of people, right? And you sort of counterpose that kind of 1 + 1 + 1 sort of sense of days going by with this idea that there's this exponential process happening at the same time that is being, you know, projected using these curvy diagrams into futures that are difficult to apprehend, right? So there's a hope that there's an attenuation and that the tide, you know, lowers again, right? But I don't know. I mean, I guess, you know, we get constant predictions about this kind of rarefication and compression of time, that, you know, there will be reopening and some social distancing and then contraction again, right? And there's going to be this pulsing character to temporality. But that's, I'm not sure what the larger yeah.
Talk about thousands of plateaus. We're in the plateaus. So I would love, like, tell us about pangolins. So in part, in reading your email in response to my note, what I'm gathering is that the particular kind of pangolin that's entangled in this COVID emergence / origin story is a different species from, it seems like the one in mainland Southeast Asia and insular Southeast Asia is undergoing dramatic declines. You've been working a lot in Africa. Just tell us all the things that you know.
I'm gonna share my screen and also show a cartoon which I think captures a lot of the ongoing themes around bats, pangolins, and the coronavirus that I just found today. So I'm trying to figure out how to put the cartoon right in the middle, but yeah, no. Let's see. Okay, is that too small for people? That's quite small, right? But anyway, I thought that's an interesting cartoon that has all the multi-species participants in the pandemic, and I thought so one of the things that I've been trying to think about is different ways that people try and trap or poach or hunt pangolins, and the ways in which the people who are trapping or hunting pangolins for the sale that's through these illicit trade networks that are smuggled wildlife trade networks is very much like going to a burrow, going to a tree, breaking the tree open, and forcing the pangolin to come out and then hitting it or with a stick or using a blunt or sharp object to like basically stun it and then put it in a bag and then take it for slaughter. And that's very different from the other ways that I've heard about in Tanzania, but also in Malaysia, about how people trap pangolins, which is to use these large bamboo traps that look quite similar to like fish traps. So like you have these sort of wormhole kind of design, and those traps have to be laid by places where pangolins would forage for ants and other insects, and the trappers would have to wait for a very long time until the pangolin decides to enter and gets trapped in there. So again, there's that temporality of like compressed time being much more related to like capitalist extraction through illegal trade, and then the kinds of pangolin trapping and consumption that's like less time compressed. So that's one of the things that I've been thinking about through the research with rodents that I've done and listening to people talk about ways of trapping animals in the bush.
Super interesting. And kind of delving into the science paper, you know, in part, you know, putting these two papers together, Stefan's Trees and Seas paper and this pangolin piece, in part it was just one paragraph that kind of jumped out at me and had resonance. So there's a sentence in here talking about recombination signals between the pangolins coronaviruses, bat coronaviruses, and human SARS-CoV-2. And it's just like trying to wrap our heads around these genealogies that are multiple, these trees that you know persistently reappear but never quite fit. You know, as Stefan was saying, like the hypothesis, like each of these cladograms, those branching diagrams that we looked at last week, is a hypothesis. And you know, in part, it's just like this inability to get past these metaphors and these images that have been with us for so long. But Jia-Hui, do you have any insights taking a look at this article? Any thoughts about kind of this origin story and how it emerged and how it relates to what you know about these networks and the wildlife markets?
Yeah, I think and obviously, like, I don't know how the different species of pangolins affect or problematize the paper we read, because I'm not a geneticist or microbiologist, but a question did come up while I was reading about, so to answer another comment that you asked earlier. So because the pangolins in Southeast Asia are very endangered, they're really hard to find these days. So, you know, I remember being able to see pangolins in the wild while I was growing up as a child. But now you almost never hear people talk about seeing pangolins in the wild in Malaysia or Indonesia. So a lot of the source of pangolin scales now have shifted from Southeast Asia to Africa. And so you get people who are illegally, and and globally this is an illegal trade, pangolin scale. So people are illegally poaching pangolins in West Africa, which is a different species from the ones in East and Southern Africa. And so I'm wondering, because the paper is based on these Southeast Asian Malayan pangolins, I'm wondering if there is a difference, you know, what the data would look like if they had scales from the other kinds of pangolins, like the Teminti, which is from Smutsia Teminti, which is the ones that are in East and South Africa, versus the Manis Javanicus. Yeah.
So part of what I'm hearing you say is that, like, this is a relatively, like, an extremely rare event that you know, one of these Southeast Asian pangolins makes its way to China. So there's like artifacts nested within artifacts here. I'm thinking also back to what Stefan was saying last week about folk categories, and as we were looking at those receptor morphologies of ACE2 and just trying to think about the propensity of the virus to move amongst different kinds of life. You know, what counts as a type, I think, is critically important here, and also what counts as a viral type. You know, Stefan, your paper talks about, there's the moment where the guy raises his hand after the talk and asks what a microbial species is, and I think we should, you know, maybe invite John Dupre to come on here and talk about promiscuous realism and, you know, what species might look like in these viral taxonomies. But, you know, it seems to be just arbitrary percentages, like, you know, this number of base pairs the same constitutes a type, constitutes a species. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking, like, you know, how might we bring sort of a praxeographic analysis to this all, to invoke mole? Like, how might we think about choreographing ontologies, and how viral genomes and surface proteins are also choreographing human ontologies at the current moment. But Stefan, do you want to say anything about what a species is and these seas and trees of information? It's another huge question, I know.
Well, maybe just going backwards from something you just said, I think one thing that really struck me when I started doing that work about the microbial genomic stuff was the way that a word that I had learned in my earlier studies of evolutionary biology, the word homology, had come to mean something other than what I had learned that it meant, which was, you know, there are two different kinds of evolutionary similarities. One is homology, which is similarity because of common descent, and the other is analogy, which is similarity, you know, just cause, or, you know, the convergent evolution, or, you know, things that are the same, but, you know, for other kinds of reasons. And, you know, by the time genomicists started making these phylogenetic trees using bioinformatic tools, they started to use the word homology just to refer to similarity, which totally confused me when I started talking. It's like, don't you mean a particular kind of similarity? It's not just similarity. There's no such thing as 95% homologous, right? It is or it isn't. It's like a binary on-off thing. Mm-hmm. And of course, the usual response to me was like, yeah, whatever. This is how we use that word. So, these evolutionary terms of art themselves are constantly changing. And the notion of species, which in its classic definition from the 1940s is super, what's the word we would say? Heteronormative. I mean, it's like super about like these bounded populations that reproduce, right? Or it's repronormative in a particular way, right? That's never worked very well for most organisms. And the evolutionary biologists who came up with that kind of definition of species, they knew that too, right? But it was something that was very tailored to a particular set of organisms that they wanted to study, right? And just kind of like not good for all kinds of other things, right? And certainly completely useless for microbes, which, yeah, have these more pragmatic kind of definitions. I was super interested that so many microbiologists use the concept of the guild, right? These kind of like medieval, almost LARPing kinds of words, right? To refer to the different kinds of things that they do. I mean, yeah. And like you say in your Jia-Hui article, Eben, I mean, species is a practical question. And sometimes that practice employs strategic essentialisms and sometimes it doesn't, right?
And I think with COVID, we're seeing lots of different ways that the species is getting enacted. So here we're talking about the bioinformatic enactment of a particular kind, but now we've got the DNA tests that are looking for a particular segment of the genome. And we also have the antibody tests that are looking at sort of the human immunological response to the viral proteins, and then kind of choreographing ontologies like that. And a lot of these tests are having ambiguous results. People are getting negative tests after getting sick, and people who aren't having any symptoms are also getting positive tests. So, these intra-actions, to use Barad's words, it's really fuzzy about who's being changed and what kinds of encounters, and how to return to something we talked about a few weeks ago, the ethical subject, like how to choreograph oneself, how to inhabit ontologies ethically is really fraught right now.
Is it okay if I jump in?
Please.
I have a few things to say, kind of following along the trail that we've been talking about. I thought it was interesting that in your article, you noted that it took 70% of the DNA sequences to be similar in order to call it a species. Mm-hmm. And that's something I've always wondered, in terms of synthetic biology, as we shift in codes and change things, at what point do we come up with something that we call different? And so that was kind of an interesting classification. Mm-hmm. But I think a lot of the discussion that's happening has to do with how biotechnology is read. And that's kind of my field is a bioartist and then a student of biotechnology. And you gave several, kind of examples of that. One was this comment about bioremediation, like how do we remediate what we've done? And you talked about, I think your quote was, I have written down, humans turn to a form of life deemed primitive to renounce and redeem our own depredations. I thought that was fantastic kind of thing. And also just in terms of how we interpret data, like in terms of the analysis of archaea, that this finding that they thought it was an old species because it had a lot of G and C, guanine and cysteine, and that was an indication of something being old. Right. But then what you said was that's just what archaea has. There's a lot of G and C's in its stuff. So, just how we're reading the biotechnology. Another comment is like our conversation has changed from the genetics in terms of DNA to now society literate about mRNA. I think that's phenomenal, that this is the level our discussions are happening on. So I guess finally, I would just say that, I wonder in terms of our response to novel genetic sequences, it's somewhere between bioprospecting and a gene drive. And how do we want to handle COVID? Do we want to bioprospect it, or do we want to gene drive the bats away? So a lot of metaphors for artists to work with that. I really appreciated your article. Terrifically well written.
Oh, thank you. There's a lot I could say, but I'd love to hear from other folks as well. But yeah, gene drive, death drive.
I guess I could jump on that. Can everybody hear me? Just as a food and waste scholar, and also as somebody who teaches biotechnology, but alongside hard scientists, I was also struck by this kind of, bioprospecting, or what some people will just call biopiracy, kind of terra nullius approach. And I was wondering the same thing along the same lines about what other vested interests we see now in the, what I'll call the slow violence made quick now through all those images that we see of flattening the curve, but it's hearkening to this slow violence that's now just sped up exponentially. It made me think a lot, Eben, of what you said last week about the rechoreographing. What did you say? I've kind of quoted here. Rechoreographing our ontologies to our connections, especially to domesticated animals. But I mean, certainly, I think we see this in Stefan's work too, in that moment where you talk about the, I think the one word that I put in the chat was the cosmopolitanism, the vent microorganism and cosmopolitanism.
Mm-hmm.
And it just made me wonder, I mean, again, as a food and waste person, I see this a lot in the waste world, especially in bioremediation attempts to sort of not looking to the by design or the pre-phases, but looking at the post phases and then trying to harness and sell and repackage.
Mm-hmm.
And own and take that terra nullius approach. So I guess my question is just, what other vested interests do we see in coronavirus, biotechnologically? I mean, obviously last week we talked a lot about pharmaceuticals, but I mean, even in the making of a vaccine, you have, interest in certain kinds of fancy chickens and eggs, and obviously I think we're using this largely not using eggs, we're using plants. So I'm just wondering what other people are thinking about in terms of these biotechnological, and the cosmopolitanism that you wrote about in the deep sea example.
Yeah, I think you touched on a lot of it. I mean, there is the pharmaceutical conversation, and last week Caitlin, pointed to the involvement of companies that were also involved in the hepatitis C treatment, and the worry about virus profiteering. That's certainly part of it. Just to do a quick shout out again to Jia-Hui. Jia-Hui's been thinking about this notion of multi-species distancing, and what kinds of intimacies and distances are being choreographed in response to this now, right? What goes together, what should go together. I don't know if you want to say anything about that, Jia-Hui.
And Jia-Hui also has some great stuff to say on viral time and this new viral era that we're entering in the 21st century.
I think all the comments are great so far and don't really have anything to add, but yeah, I think with the biotechnology question that Rachel brought up, I think it's interesting. It's important to think about like how technology is changing. So I think I'm thinking as well about Susan Sontag's work, like if cancer is the metaphor for talking about the time we live in now and all its growth, uncontrolled growth, like are we entering like a COVID time or like a viral time, and is that describing the kinds of technological reconfiguration of the bios that we're seeing that makes us live in this new age of distancing among people and among species.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm thinking too of Bettina's work about wildness, right? And just, I mean, so much of the multi-species distancing, to use Jia-Hui's term, is about this kind of worry that things are not wild enough, or things that were wild have been pressed into unwelcome domesticities. So I kind of wonder if if you have any ideas, Bettina, about, you know, what this virus story is doing to notions of the wild.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm still thinking about it. I'm also a little bit brain fried right now because it's like 12:30 a.m. in the morning right now. I'm totally tired today.
Yeah.
I may have some more answers next week, but I mean, it's, you know, I don't know. I think it's weird, you know, because it seems like I'd love to talk to Jia-Hui more about, you know, about the idea of the multi-species distancing, because I think it is so interesting to think about, you know, how the kind of, in a sense, the intimacies and the entanglements with the wild and the encroachment on, you know, wildlife habitats have now kind of created, in a sense, you know, the multi-species distancing. I'm not sure like whether that's how you're using it, but I just find that so, yeah, I don't know, puzzling and yeah, just really puzzling. And so, yeah, I don't know whether that's how you're using it, Jia-Hui, the kind of multi-species distancing, how you're kind of thinking about that. But
yeah, oh, sorry.
Go ahead. But just for those of you who have to leave because we're at the hour mark, I just wanted to say, let's keep going as long as we want today. I feel like it's just kind of getting started in the chat. Like there's really dynamic discussion that's about to happen, and I don't want to cut it off. But for those of you who do have to leave, next week I've asked Tim Dean to share some of his work on unlimited intimacy. It's a book that I first read together with Emily when we were in a seminar together at Princeton a few years back. It's a challenging book about communities that value pleasure over health. So it's about the biosocial communities that form in queer cultures where HIV viral seroconversion is what gets you into the group. So you become a member of these groups by getting the virus. It's, you know, intimacy is something I think on a lot of people's minds right now. But back to Jia-Hui, tell us more about multi-species distancing.
And I would love to hear what other people are also thinking about. So I think what has been really striking is how this pandemic has renewed questions about what kinds of species are able to meet or not meet, and the kinds of other kinds of meetings that are used to then control these other meetings. So an example that I'm thinking about is from my research, there are these rats, but you can also find dogs that are being trained to detect illegally smuggled wildlife products, usually around like shipping containers, ports, exits of national parks in an African context I'm thinking about. And so these are relations that are being cultivated among certain kinds of species to then enact or enforce a distancing between other types of species, so between humans and pangolins in this instance, or between humans and illegally hunted or poached game or ivory. So so I think that is the question I'm really curious about, and I would love to hear what Bettina is thinking as well with African swine fever and the building of these fences that you've talked about, Bettina, that enforces a kind of distance or that prohibits a certain kind of relationality. What kinds of moral economies are influencing or allowing people to make these decisions about what species should meet, what species shouldn't meet, right? Is it a racialized one, as we see with the Orientalism in the Wuhan case, or is it other kinds of visions about what nature, culture should be?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. I'm kind of thinking about that right now too, because I'm actually just writing a little bit about it, because I basically just last week I drove along the German, Czech, Polish, and Austrian border because I got kicked out of my apartment in Munich because the people actually I was renting from, they had to return from South Africa because of the whole situation. Anyway, long story, but it was just so striking to me that I was driving near the border there, and because of the African swine fever, and I can talk about this maybe some other time. This is going to go too deeply into the African swine fever discussion, but there have been large outbreaks of African swine fever throughout Eastern Europe, and specifically there's been a lot of border practices emerging both in Germany and also in Denmark, building border fences to keep wild boar out of moving across borders. And so it just struck me so much driving along the border there last week, what's been to kind of look at what happened, to keep the boar, to keep the wildlife out. And now actually with the COVID situation, people can't move across the borders, and so, and the kind of wild boar have moved largely out of the picture, at least, around in the public debate. And so I don't know where that gets us, but I just kind of thought that was so striking in terms of, how the multi-species, to use your word, the multi-species distancing is kind of, and bordering practices are kind of mapping out in the current moment as well. And I assume that may be changing as well, as COVID, kind of maybe is detected in other species. I don't know what the actual status is, with other wildlife being, diagnosed with the disease possibly in the future. I don't know.
Shelby House, I don't know if that's your real name, but you just made a really interesting, relevant comment in the chat. Do you want to share it with everyone?
Yeah, that is my real name. Hi.
Oh, cool. It's a cool name.
I've been thinking, a lot about the use of the term exotic, because I've been really bothered to see, like overtly racist coverage in things like CNN or USA Today, but even within these kind of academic circles or like quasi-academic blogs, this focus on exotic animals. And Claire Jean Kim has like a great analysis of how in animal rights activists, like their struggle to ban live animal markets in San Francisco's Chinatown, like by emphasizing this optic of animal cruelty or cruelty, it elides this much longer history of racist tropes against Chinese Americans. And but I have been thinking about two buckets of, one, we see pangolins as this symbol of this era, but also tigers. All of the news about like the tiger who was infected at the Bronx Zoo, and even like Tiger King and Joe Exotic, I think it's interesting to think about what it means when we use that term, and what claims are being made versus a species being invasive and then marked as killable has been on my mind a lot. So this conversation has been great.
There's a lot of amazing comments. People just jump in from the sharing ideas from the chat.
Okay, I'm gonna jump in. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. So there's been so many wonderful threads. I really want to thank everyone. Stefan, I think those are really hard questions I've been through at you, and you have been very gracious with pulling them in different directions. And obviously Jia-Hui and Bettina, it's so nice to hear from all of you. So I guess I want to go back to a couple different themes. Okay, so I'm just going to write them down so that I can connect them. So I'm thinking about science fiction and also about living on an alien planet, which is something that I got from Chalobert, who writes about science fiction religion and also science fiction novels and multi-species entanglements as well. And when I was reading Stefan's article, and there was all this work on, you know, the transformation of the kingdoms into this different format in the 90s with, you know, the bacteria, the Arachnia, I think is it called, and Arachia, and the different, you know, and how foreign these ancestors are to us, in the sense of, and also how difficult it is to analyze them, right? So I remember listening to a lecture where they were talking about one of the reasons why it was so difficult to analyze bacteria in laboratories is because it's actually very hard to isolate them. And that, like, I can't remember what context it was, but I know that there was a scientist who was talking about how they actually had to like invent this like nano kind of catcher, like a nano swab, to be able to isolate a bacterium, to be able to look at it, right, and to be able to analyze it, because the conditions of the laboratory actually made it very difficult to analyze, right? So this is, so when we're thinking about the wet, right, or when we're thinking about, you know, the conditions for life to exist and to even be looked at, thinking about how difficult these organisms are to look at as well. And then, but then also, Stefan, you know, your work in your article was so lovely also because it goes from the tree of life into this much more like into the puddle, right? Like I would say that's a very Harawaiian type of analysis, right? The mud, right? The squishy, the not only the womb, but the semen and the, you know, matter that's like wet and gross and promiscuous. And you know, we've talked about intimacy. And, you know, this COVID virus, in terms of its infection, the way that it broaches our intimacy, right, in sort of these fluids that are, that we do share without realizing, right? So all these graphics that we're getting of how saliva travels in these incredible promiscuous ways without us realizing it, right? And so yeah, so I was just thinking about the Thulucene, and, you know, especially because you're a Hawaiian scholar, I feel like your work really, it makes so much, when we're thinking about the COVID time, right, about this deep time that stretches back to our ancestors in this microbiological realm, also kind of thinking about the deep time, you know, it's a much shorter period, but it's also a significant period of thinking about the plantation scene, or, you know, like the way that the extractive model has kind of brought us to what Jia-Hui was calling like this viral time of the now, right? This moment when we're so much more vulnerable because of the extractive mode that's like accumulated, and, you know, and which is not only beginning, it's been lashing out for a while, but it's just, you know, we happen to be living through it right now. But yeah, I think I'll just end there. And I also, just because we started off with religion, and I'm not really a religion person, but I am an animist person. And you know, one of the things that I learned when I studied with shaman or jankris in Nepal was that one of the most vital places where they go to be able to heal people during their travels is to the underworld, right? To the netherworld region. And the netherworld region is a region of water, right? And it's the place where all these fantastical and strange alien creatures reside. And they have to kind of parlay with these creatures to be able to then move back into the middle world to be able to heal. And so I couldn't help but kind of want to also hang on to different types of worldings in terms of how we're thinking of disease and also reasons for disease, right? So one of the things that the jankris actually say is that when humans are kind of disrupting the technosphere or the earth sphere, the biosphere, the nagas get upset, right? They get angry. and they react in this kind of like explosive way, whether it's through flooding or whether it's through virus. And so that has also been really something that I've been thinking with as I see this mass sickness, right? You know, how are we going to heal when the earth is so damaged, right? This is, you're right, Jia-Hui, this is the beginning of just more. This isn't going to be the first pandemic. There's going to be more because the extractive mode is still here. And we see that with Trump, right? We see Trump rolling back the EPA regulations, like, you know, just having zero concern about how those things are related. And I do think that this is a failure in some ways of our disciplines, of science in particular, of not being able to correlate all of these things together, right? Of being able to put together the political with these outbreaks, or perhaps like very purposefully keeping them apart. Of course, a group like this doesn't do that. But anyway, those are just some very preliminary ideas. Thank you for letting me share.
Thanks, Lisette. Does anyone want to have the last word? Stefan, Jia-Hui, anyone else? All right.
I think that's a pretty good last word already.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, and thanks, Jia-Hui, for sharing your thoughts. Do you want to say anything about, you've got a paper in progress that I've had the privilege of reading. I think it's great, and submit it, please, so we can all read it.
Yeah, I would love if people want to talk more offline or back channel about this. I'm happy to, yeah.
And also in terms of back channel, so I've got a Facebook page, but it turns out that it's really centralized and it's hard for other people to post on it. So I've created the coronavirus multi-species group. So if you want a back channel that's just this group, there's like a subgroup, or there's all sorts of other, and Jia-Hui also figured out, like, you can just CC everybody in email, but I don't think everyone's on the email chain and not everyone's on Facebook. So there's like segmented conversations going on. But great to see you all. See you all next week. It's a challenging read. I'll say the Tim Dean stuff is challenging because it upends fundamental norms about biopolitics and safety, and it makes a lot of people uncomfortable. So when we read it in this seminar at Princeton a few years back, I had to totally upend the schedule because we had to talk about it for 2 weeks because it was such a challenging reading. But and Tim hasn't 100% confirmed that he'll be with us physically. He's never done a Zoom before, but we'll be talking about it with or without Tim on the line. So thanks all, and see you soon.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Everybody.
Stay safe.
Thank you.